You know, I'm going to give you a history lesson.
We got some dumbass motherfuckers floating around this country.
Start laughing! And when I do, start.
Also, y'all did some nasty-ass jokes on my ass, too.
Funny jokes and unfunny jokes come out of the same birth.
You f***ing guys are unbelievable.
Why are you laughing?
Evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Why Are You Laughing, a history of comedy podcast. And today, I'm pleased to introduce to you the great Carl Reiner, a man who's had a historic career. I don't know that I would say he's at the forefront of people's minds, particularly like my generation, when you think of old greats, even his good buddy Mel Brooks and Norman Lear, who we'll talk about in a second, probably come to mind before Carl Reiner. And maybe even some people think of Rob Reiner before Carl Reiner, but if that's true, it's a shame, because Carl Reiner's a true legend of the game and has had some great moments that we will discuss. And I mentioned Norman Lear, too, that before we get into anything, I want to address that as we record this, it was just announced a couple hours ago. Norman Lear passed away at 101 years old. By the time you guys are listening to this, I'm sure you've already heard. But yeah, Norman Lear, one of the biggest figures in television history, no longer with us. And it's, you know, we did an episode very early on about Norman Lear, which, as I remember, we were on the side of Eric Monty on a lot of issues. So I don't know if it's a glowing memorial of Norman Lear, but go right. Check it out. Norman Lear, you know, we talked about it with Red Fox a little bit too. There are some issues with Norman Lear that you could definitely call into question, but the guy's a legend. When you just look at three shows, All in the Family, The Jeffersons, and Sanford and Son, three of the biggest shows in television history, and also just like race relations in general. Like if you take sitcoms, you know, it's not the most it doesn't have the same impact as Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. I'm aware of that, but if you look at like the history of television, I don't know if there are two bigger sitcoms in black culture than Sanford and Son and The Jeffersons. You could probably throw The Cosby Show in there, maybe. But The Jeffersons and Sanford and Son, certainly two of the biggest. And All in the Family, by most accounts, people would probably call the best sitcom of all time. You know, I'm impartial to Seinfeld, but I'm also aware there's no George Costanza, Homer Simpson, Larry David, any of these great characters without Archie Bunker. You know, Peter Griffin, Cartman. Like, these characters don't exist. They're all influenced by the character of Archie Bunker that Norman Lear created. So shout out to Norman Lear. You can't really, you know, it's hard to shed a tear for him. The guy lived to 101. Seemed like a lot of good years. He was working pretty much all the way till the end. Like, I don't know. I can't think of seeing him in too recent memory, but like the thing he did with Kimmel, you know, bringing those live shows back, that was only like 2 years ago. He was 99. So worked into his hundreds, which is pretty impressive. So shout out to Norman Lear. And also, in comedy-related deaths, for you, I know a lot of you guys are Howard Stern fans, Ralph Cirella died. Howard Stern's stylist and longtime best buddy. Yeah, there are a lot of rumors about what Howard and Ralph's relationship were, but Ralph also died today, so very sad. I don't know, you know, whenever we do Howard Stern, I always admit that I don't know the nitty-gritty the way I do with Opie and Anthony. So, like, anytime I would hear Ralph's phone calls, it was always him piling on someone. You know, Artie was getting ragged on, so Ralph would call in and goof on him. We did probably play a few clips of Ralph on 9/11. He was on the phone for that. So a lot of phone calls when, like, big things were happening. But I don't know a lot of Ralph segments where Ralph was the center. So if you guys do, if you have any suggestions, then we could definitely do a Ralph, maybe a bonus Ralph episode or something like that on the Patreon. And I'll also look into some of those segments as well. But maybe we'll do something with Ralph Cirella if you guys have any suggestions. So R.I.P. to everybody. But you know what's not dead and is very much alive, and that's blindmike.net. That's what Norman Lear and Ralph Cirella would have wanted. I think they're dying words, both of them. They called each other, and they said, we should subscribe to blindmike.net, and then they died, unfortunately. So if you guys want to replace the money that they would have injected into this program, then become a Patreon or YouTube member. We appreciate it. You get bonus episodes, as well as early releases. You get all these free Why You Laughing episodes a week early, and all the bonus content that we put up there as well. Or you can just support the show for free. We appreciate that also. Subscribe on YouTube or wherever else you get podcasts. Leave a comment, share, tell a friend about it. If you have friends that are comedy fans that would like this kind of stuff, let them know. Post it on Instagram or wherever you share things personally. And we appreciate that. All of that helps the program. So go to blindmike.net. Thank you very much.
And if you are a niche fan of Quincy, there are new shirts up now, the Clugmania shirts.
Oh, or even, if you're a Why You Laughing fan too, we have Why You Laughing merch. I never mention it, so you probably don't know it exists, but it is up there if you want like hoodies and shirts and stuff like that. You can click the merch tab at blindmike.net as well. So, all right, enough of that. These people, Norman Lear's going to be celebrated enough this week. Who's not remembered enough, and that's Carl Reiner. And I hope I didn't overstate how underrated he is. Certainly people know Carl Reiner, whether it's his directorial work, his writing work, or his, on-camera persona. People definitely know who he is. He's just not quite as big a name. Like, I think Mel Brooks, everyone could rattle off at least 3-4 projects Mel Brooks has worked on, even if you're not a huge fan. Carl Reiner, I don't know if he has that same impact, because a lot of his greatest projects you don't associate with Carl Reiner. You might associate with Dick Van Dyke or Steve Martin or even Mel Brooks. So that's what we're doing today, is paying homage to the great Carl Reiner. And as we always say, these old guys, I love talking about these old guys because they always have a story. It's not usually someone that just went to theater school and then became an actor and then became a comedian. No, it's someone that lived a life, has a little dirt under their fingernails. And that's certainly Carl Reiner fits into that category. So let's start with his early days, because as a lot of guys did in this generation, Carl Reiner was working in a factory at the age of 16.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt instituted a thing called the WPA, and my brother Charlie came to me. I was working in a machinist shop, fixing hat machines. I was getting $8 a week, and I was 17 years old. I had graduated high school at 16, and my brother Charlie came to me and said, look at this thing I found on the Daily News, the WPA project, a Works Progress Administration, funding the arts, giving a chance to people in the arts to work. There's a dramatic school that is for free downtown in Center Street. Why don't you go there, Carl? I had no idea. I always could be funny. I could tell jokes. I could do voices, but I didn't have any way to become an actor until my brother Charlie showed me this thing. And because Charlie and a government that cared about the people, I am here today. I thank you.
And Carl Reiner's a war veteran, obviously, but also his brother Charlie fought in 11 major battles in World War II, including Iwo Jima. So, like, he really is an American hero. And was there more to that clip? Did I cut it off, Craig?
No, I accidentally clicked it when I was minimizing it.
So what's, what we don't appreciate enough is, like, there's plenty of people that bitch about this generation and we're pussies now, and we forget the generations before us and all that. But we don't do enough is pay tribute to the guys that did give us the privilege to be pussies, basically. You know what I mean? Like, guys like Carl Reiner legitimately fought for this, but also, like, appreciated the fact that he was 16 years old. His brother said, take a writing class. And then when he got out of the military, he was able to use those skills, and he would tell other people to do that. Like, he was very, not to get too political, super left-leaning, but a lot of what he advocated for, and you could even hear it in that speech, was government programs that help the arts. And I know Craig wants to tear those down, but Carl Reiner was definitely an advocate for a lot of that stuff, because he came up. Those are the people I respect much more than people that come up in my generation and bitch about things. Is Carl Reiner's a guy who literally fought in a war and then said, all right, now let's try to give people a better life. Try and benefit these people so they don't have to do that kind of stuff. Appreciated the country that he came up in. And that's why I always like talking about these guys that you would never really know. Like, it's, now I think people make it into, if a war broke out and Mark Normand was fighting in it, he would do an hour on it, obviously. And I don't begrudge him for that, certainly. But, like, if you listen to Rickles or Mel Brooks or Carl Reiner. Like in interviews, they'll talk about it when asked, but it wasn't like, Mel Brooks did a one-man show on his struggle in the military and things. Like now we're much more encouraged to wear our hardships on our sleeves. Whereas those guys were like, yeah, that was a part of my life. I did that, and I appreciate the life I have now. It made them into better men rather than like giving them fodder for content,
Exactly. And after hearing about Carl's like experience in the war and stuff, it makes me hate his son that much more.
Well, listen, I knew Craig would turn this. Rob Reiner's done a lot of great things. He's become a real hateable follow on Twitter. But, we're not here to talk about that today.
Next, we have him talking more about World War II.
Okay, good. Let's hear it. This is him with Conan, right?
Yeah.
You were in the Army, and we're talking, is this World War II?
World War II.
And you were performing. One of the things you did is that they saw that you were a good performer. So that became kind of your job, was to perform for the soldiers. Isn't that right?
It was a very fascinating thing. I was in Oahu, and I went to see Maurice Evans did a play called Hamlet in Fatigues.
Mm-hmm.
I went to see it, and there's my friend Howard Morris. I'd seen him on the
legendary comedic performer.
We worked together on the NYA radio workshop, and I said, "My God, that's Howard." I went backstage, and I said, "Howard, you were Laertes, you were a sensation." Without taking a bow, he said, "Do you have an act?" I said, "Well, I work in the records." He said, "We need a comedian for this touring show." And I said, "Well, I'm going someplace tomorrow. Detachment 18, really the next day."
Right.
Detachment 18 was going to Iwo Jima for the invasion.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I said, he says, "Well, come and audition for Maurice Evans and Captain Ludden, Alan Ludden."
Yeah.
And my friend Saul Palmer says, "Go find out how good you are. Let the professionals tell you." I went auditioned, and Alan Ludden said, "We'd like to have you with us." I said, "I'm going someplace tomorrow." He says, "We'll arrange that you don't." I said, "How can you do that?" He says, "Call General Richardson and replace you."
This is amazing. You were on your way to go to Iwo Jima, where so many people didn't come back.
I know.
And then you, at the last second, get to be a performer. How hard is it for performing for troops? I'm thinking World War II, those troops, they'll let you know if you're not funny. It's not going to be a polite crowd. Is that true?
Yes, it is. I must say that I killed. I was
And that's what I respect so much about those old guys is like, hey, do you want to come act in this thing? It's like, I'm going somewhere tomorrow. Somewhere was Iwo Jima. I don't know. I got a thing to take care of. Sorry, I can't do it. But he said,
about a war.
Yeah, right. He said, what he liked about writing and eventually becoming a writer is like when he would act and stuff like he was just talking about, he literally said like, I had William Shakespeare writing for me. So acting was easy. What I found challenging and interesting was writing about my experiences and coming up with things to write about. And that's kind of where he got into writing more so.
Next, we have him talking about Sid Caesar.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about Carl in the Mel Brooks episode because their careers are so tied together, as well as Sid Caesar, because that's where all these guys met. Now, Mel was like a freelancer, essentially, writing jokes for Sid, and Sid was paying him on the side. Carl Reiner was a much bigger part of that show. He was basically the straight man to Sid Caesar. So he was on camera. People knew who he was. Even like later, Mary Tyler Moore said she was excited to work with Carl Reiner because she had a crush on him from the Sid Caesar's Your Show of Shows. So like he was a guy that was known, and like that's the thing is I don't know how big Your Show of Shows was at the time, but also remember essentially a third of everyone that had a TV was watching that. That's the interesting thing about like networks at that time is you really only had three options. So even the shitty shows people enjoyed, but Your Show of Shows people attribute as like one of the very early variety shows. Basically, it was sketch comedy at a time where like that wasn't a big thing, and then that art form kind of died after Your Show of Shows for a brief time until I guess according to Carl Reiner, Carol Burnett brought it back, and then it was obviously SNL and so many things. Now you can list 15 notable sketch comedy shows that have been in the last 30-40 years, but at the time it wasn't done that much, obviously, because these are the early days of television. So let's hear a little bit more about his relationship with Sid Caesar.
And in the third week, I was in Max's office where we all congregated to hear the material that was written in those first 2 days. And that's where I got my first little foot in the door, or a big foot in the door, because I knew when I came on the show that I would never be able to use my ability to double talk, which I did in my act. I did French and Italian double talk. And Sid was the master and is the master. Nobody's ever done double talk languages like he had. And I said, well, I'll never be able to use mine because mine is a cut below his. But I got the idea. I said, why don't we do a French movie? We all used to go see French movies, Italian movies, and Japanese movies. And together, we'd always go. In the first 3 weeks, no, but from then on, we knew when we said we had all seen Japanese movies and foreign movies, not in concert. So when I said, let's do a French movie, and they said, how are you going to do a French movie? We had done silent movies. We had done at that point, we hadn't done many takeoffs of big movies yet, American movies. And they said, how? And I got up and I went to Sid and I started to sell him some cigarettes or something in double talk. And immediately we had this conversation. We got into a fight and they said, great. And Imogene said, I don't know how to do that. I said, well, we'll write it out for you. We'll write out the double talk. So that's the week I got into the writer's room. That was the most important moment for me, that I had the guts to get up and say, let's do this. And Max Liebman says, okay, you're in the writer's room now. So I was a writer without portfolio. I was what they call an effing actor.
So that's really, stories like that really stand out to me in particular as a guy who's, timid and self-conscious and nervous, like won't take a lot of those chances. It's always it's a little inspiring when you hear a guy like that basically say, because how much different would Carl Reiner's career have been if he was like, well, I'm not supposed to talk to Sid Caesar. I'm not supposed to talk to the head writer or whatever. Like, that's not my role. So now the problem is judging those moments and knowing your spots and knowing when that's right, because so many times those things backfire. I'm sure there's 10 million to 1 the amount of stories where some asshole approached a guy in the position of Sid Caesar and was like, let me give you my ideas, or let me riff with you for a minute. And they just weren't funny, or it was the wrong time. He was in a bad mood, whatever. So I'm not saying just do it all the time, but it does kind of go to show you at moments like that where Sid Caesar says like, hey, I had the guts to approach this guy, give him my ideas, and it paid off. So those moments always stand out to me.
Yeah, and it's always the way the people get approached. I know you've talked about it before too. Like when you were first looking for a producer, you had people like sending stuff in, telling you why people suck and like this isn't funny because this and all that stuff.
Well, it's usually like a fan of Kirk's is just like, I've never produced anything before, but I'd like to be essentially part of Kirk's show,
Right.
So yeah, it's like you have to be able to back it up, which Carl Reiner obviously could.
Right. Next, we move on to Seinfeld and Carl talking about Mel Brooks, which kind of gets more into their relationship.
So they did a very good comedians in cars getting coffee episode with the Sign Man, and this is a thing. So actually, I just watched Judd Apatow put out Bob and Don, a love story about Bob Newhart and Don Rickles' relationship. We also talked a lot about that when we talked about Newhart, and it was interesting because Newhart says in there, like, it's the documentary starts by Newhart saying, in his final days, Don was like, hey, keep my name alive. And that's something you kind of forget about these guys, because they are very old school and they keep a lot of their emotions in and everything like that. You forget these were guys that like wanted to be famous and wanted to be known, and they do appreciate people keeping their names alive. And I think that's what guys like Mel Brooks, Norman Lear, Bob Newhart, Rick, like, they really appreciated that and lifted each other up over the years and like wanted to promote each other. So let's hear a little from these boys.
Mel comes over every night.
Every night.
How long is that relationship?
From 1950 on.
So that's 62 years.
First day I met him, he got up and did a Jewish pirate. Hysterical. He said, I can't afford to pillage and rape anymore. $3.50 for sale clothes. Who can afford that? He went on. And the following day, I came in and said, here's a man who was at the scene of the crucifixion 2,000 years ago. And I started to interview the 2000.
Because he had done the pirate, so
Yeah.
you went back even further.
Yeah, I said, here's a man who knows everything.
Okay, so Mel comes over. About what time at night would you say he gets there?
8 o'clock to eat. But
And what do you guys watch?
We like a movie if somebody says, secure the perimeter.
Anything where they secure the perimeter.
And somebody says, get some rest.
Get
Get some rest. We watch Jeopardy when we eat.
But wait a minute. What, Jeopardy's not on at 8 o'clock.
I tape it.
You,
Seinfeld's almost, because all these guys are so successful and everything, and Seinfeld's almost mystified that these guys just go to each other's house and they tape Jeopardy and watch it together, because that is so rare. Even you mentioned KMS. It was a week or two ago that we were mentioning duos or even like bands. How there's always some riff because of the egos that get involved. And when you look at Newhart and Rickles and Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner, they never had that. They were able to sustain a friendship for 70 years or whatever it is, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. And I think the main thing is like these guys weren't dependent on each other. Because when I was watching the Newhart and Rickles thing, I thought to myself, boy, that's such a natural like buddy comedy.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like you would think there'd be like 3 or 4 movies starring Newhart and Rickles, with Newhart as the straight man and Rickles as the crazy guy. And Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks kind of have that same dynamic, and you think, why didn't they do more together? Obviously, they did the 2,000-Year-Old Man together. They've done a ton of interviews together and everything. But why didn't they do more together? And I think you start to realize, like, oh, that's how they were. That's the only reason they're friends for 70 years is they didn't work together too much. They didn't get sick of each other. There wasn't a game of egos going on, and they were able to, be distant enough that they could go to each other's house every night and have dinner. And the other thing that I think Carl Reiner mentioned this. It could have been in the Apatow documentary, but I think this was Carl Reiner that basically said, like, our wives were friends. Like, if our wives didn't like each other, we'd be fucked. But luckily, like, we can go on vacations together. We can go to dinner together. Like, that's pretty much what drives those relationships. And it's very rare in Hollywood, but I think those are probably 2 of the best examples of like true friendships.
Yep. There's something to working with people that you like. It just never ends well.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So he mentions there the 2,000-Year-Old Man thing. The story is basically that, like, the only reason they recorded that at first is that Carl Reiner was trying to get his tape recorder to work. And in an effort to do that, he was just like, I understand you were at the crucifixion. And Mel Brooks just riffs. And then they start doing that at parties and things, which we'll hear about. But it is funny how those things just happen. And, Larry David always said, like, he wrote Seinfeld for his friends. Like, he wanted to make his friends laugh. And I think that's so much of comedy where it's these guys are just trying to break each other's balls or make each other laugh. And then you realize, like, oh, an audience would like this. Like, they want to be in on the joke with us.
It's the most relatable thing you can do.
Yeah.
Because everyone's got their group of friends, bust balls, whatever.
For sure.
But on the 2,000-Year-Old Man, we have been talking with Mark Maron about it.
Yeah, so let's hear a little more about that.
And at one particular party out here at an A-list party, that was Joyce Haber's name for real stars, at an A-list party, after we finished, 3 people came up to us. The first one was George Burns, smoking a cigar and saying, you got that on a record? And we said, no. He said, well, put it on a record or I'm going to steal it. And then it was Edward G. Robinson said, he's making play out of the 1,000-Year-Old Man. He said, I want to play that on Broadway. And I said, it's 2,000 years. I can play any age. I remember saying that. And the last one coming up was the dearest of all was a guy named Steve Allen, who cared about handing the world comedy people. He would love nothing more than to discover a comedian,
great champion,
and say, here he is. Yeah. And so he came over and he says, fellas, he says, you got to put that on record. He says, I'll give you a studio that I use for World Pacific for my jazz recordings. And we went into that studio with about 150 friends, and we wailed for 2-3 hours.
That was the original.
And we cut it down to 47 minutes. And then we still didn't know it was going to work. That wasn't for friends.
And they mentioned Steve Allen there, and you hear the way they're talking about Steve Allen being a champion of comedy. A lot of people, so a lot of the Howard Stern detractors over the years have pointed at Steve Allen as a guy that Howard completely ripped off, or at least was influenced by. But Steve Allen had a lot more influence in comedy than you don't hear his name a lot in this generation of guys, but he definitely had some impact, and he was very good to Carl and Mel, and wanted, like, he would have them on his show. And he saw the brilliance in this 2,000-year-old man bit, and it's arguably, I don't know, it's tough to me. The thing I know Carl Reiner most from was The Jerk, but then you look at like Dick Van Dyke Show, and you know how long that reran on television, and the 2,000-year-old man, and the way people still talk about that to this day. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what his most influential thing was. Same with Mel Brooks. But like in looking at interviews for both of these guys, having done an episode on both of them now, they get asked about the 2,000-year-old man bit a lot. And like particularly Mel Brooks has done so many movies since then, and people still bring that up. So for Steve Allen at a party, and George Burns and all these guys that they mentioned, for them to be like, you got to do something with that. It's very smart. And again, how like these guys encouraged each other. And it is always weird to me. Like, this was a big thing back in the day, and I guess it's the early days of, the form of entertainment that we have now. It was the very early days of TV and radio and that kind of stuff. So it's just a different world that I can't really get my head around. But if two cornballs were doing a bit they had rehearsed at a party I was at, I would certainly not think, oh, well, these two will be legends in 70 years.
Yeah. Back then, no, they didn't have phones, so they were probably like, oh, thank God, something to do.
Yeah, right. Let's hear a little more about what went into that.
This is England.
Yeah, so, this crossed over the pond, as they say, and became a very big thing. And this is a funny story about, is it Carrie Grant he's talking about? I think.
It was my neighbor, and I gave him an album, and he came back and he says, Carl, can I have a dozen? And I said, well, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to London. I says, are you going to take him to London? Yes. He said, they speak English there, And he came back and he said, she loved it. I said, ooh, he's the Queen Mother. I said, you took this to Buckingham Palace.
Oh, my God.
He says, yes. And she laughed. And I said to Mel, the biggest chicks in the world accepted it. So anybody, of course, it did take off for that first album. And then we made 5 albums.
You got the royal stamp of approval.
Yes, the royal stamp.
It'd be so funny if like Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks weren't successful and they still had that story.
Yeah, I know.
Like Carrie Grant just went and told the Queen and she loved it, and the people would be like, oh, bullshit. Yeah, right. But yeah, it had very mainstream appeal, which is the influence that had. Like, I think Woody Allen, you could watch this by watching 3 seconds of each of these men. Woody Allen probably had much more influence on Larry David than Mel Brooks did. But then when you listen to like just the idea of what the 2,000-year-old man bit is, it's a guy talking very generically and kind of stereotypically Jewish for the time, in a way that obviously he wouldn't have been talking about 2,000 years ago, but he's talking about topics that existed then, like, Jesus coming into his store and he never buys anything. Like that, the conversational aspect of that, like huge impact on Seinfeld, I think. Like just when you watch George and Jerry riffing, it feels very much like the way that Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks would improv with each other.
Yeah, just even his overstuffed wallet, just something like that.
Right.
Last clip from Marin, but this is him talking about the straight man.
Yeah, this I think is a big deal because Carl Reiner was so good at being the straight man that it impacted his life, and I think made him less of a recognizable figure than a lot of other people because he was so good at being the straight man.
In terms of being a straight man, in terms of being a guy that's known as that, what does that require? I mean,
it requires. I've finally figured it out only in the last couple of months. What I really am. If somebody said, "What are you?" I am the master of ceremonies. I get a greater kick out of saying, "And here is," because I've done hundreds of benefits for the Writers Guild, the Directors Guild, and I MC these shows. I never prepare because I can't prepare. I've had this ability since I'm 18 years old, and I found it right there at the Alabama Acres, where I used to do the game shows. I used to introduce acts, and I would find the fun by looking out at the audience. I would say what's on their minds, or it's on everybody's mind. You say the truth. You don't have to be funny.
Right.
You say the absolute truth that everybody's thinking, and somebody dares to say it, and becomes terribly funny. So I've had this ability, and I realized that what I always have done is, and enjoyed doing, was introducing people. And when you introduce a funny person, and they get it, you come out smiling and applauding, you're part of the, you're part of it. You are the one.
So, you know, and I'm guilty of this. I don't want to make it sound, I've realized I've done it already, that I've made it sound like I've discovered some nobody in Carl Reiner. I am fully aware he's very famous and successful. And I remember when we did the Gary Shandling episode, Carl was saying that listened to the episode, and he goes, you know, people know who Gary Shandling is, right? Because I guess I talked about how underrated he is so much that it made it seem like I was like, guys, you should hear about this Gary Shandling guy.
Carl needs to understand there are people that will listen that don't know. That's who we're talking to.
Well, but not only that, my thing, like when I'm talking about Carl Reiner, super successful, obviously. But what's interesting about that, and I guess you just have to determine what's more important to you. But if Carl Reiner had more of an ego, he probably could have been more of an in front of the camera presence. Like, he was a very talented guy. Maybe he could have done that. Maybe it wouldn't have worked. Who knows? But like, his career could have been entirely different if he had more of an ego. His self-awareness to say, like, hey, I'm the straight man. I'm a great master of ceremonies. I'm great at introducing people and kind of, you know, letting them shine. I think that worked to his benefit, and he knew who he was. He knew, and that allowed him to be a good director and a good writer. Like, bitterness kills a lot of comedians.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess that's my point, is if Carl Reiner had more of an ego, maybe it would have worked, but it also wouldn't have allowed him to have, you know, a 70-year friendship with Mel Brooks and a 50-year friendship with Norman Lear. And, you know, his marriage lasted until he had a very successful marriage. So these relationships wouldn't be as healthy if Carl Reiner had more of an ego. And that's what I was most impressed about him with, because oftentimes the straight man in a duo, like, you know, we talk about Opie and Anthony a lot. Opie's a perfect example of that. But there's, you know, a litany, I would say, with most duos like that. The straight man wants you to know how funny he actually is. Because the straight man never gets respect. You just think like, oh, he's there to let the other guy go off and riff. You don't realize that there's a skill to that. Carl Reiner realized there was a skill to it and didn't care if you noticed. And that's what was, you know, in my like going through this, what was most impressive to me about him is he didn't want any of that spotlight, even though he wanted it enough to be in Hollywood for so many years, but he didn't really care if he was, you know, the second fiddle on a project.
He also was on the Dick Van Dyke Show.
Yeah, so the Dick Van Dyke Show, as he's going to explain, was his creation. And, you know, because he was a kind of a known figure in your show of shows and working with Sid Caesar and everything, people were trying to pitch him sitcoms. And like you said, the variety show was kind of dead. So what he had known wasn't working anymore. He couldn't really pitch those. So he had to start pitching sitcoms. And this is one idea that he had. And we'll talk more about it once we hear this.
Well, right after the show of shows ended with Sid Caesar and Caesar's Hour, the review format was dead until Carol Burnett brought it back.
She brought it back, yeah.
And so I was being offered situation comedies, and they weren't very good. And my wife read one. She said, "Why don't you write one?" I said, "I don't know how to write that." I was on Fire Island, and I said to myself, what piece of ground do I stand on that nobody stands on? I live in New Rochelle, work in New York on a variety show. So I'll write about that. And I wrote a thing called Head of the Family, and it was financed by Peter Lawford. He paid for the pilot, and I wrote 13 episodes so I'd have it ready in case it went on. Other writers would have a template. And so I did the pilot with Barbara Britton and Morty Gunty and Sylvie Miles. It was fair. It was okay.
And you were the star.
I played Robert Petrie. It was okay. Didn't sell. And
I started doing movies. I wrote a movie for Doris Day, The Thrill of It All.
Mm-hmm.
And Sheldon Leonard got a hold of these 13 scripts from my agent, and he called me and he says, these are very good. I said, well, Sheldon, I don't want to fail twice with the same material.
Mm-hmm.
And here I impersonate him pretty well. He says, you won't fail? I'll get a better actor to play you.
And that's exactly what they did. And that's how they found Dick Van Dyke. And what's interesting to me, again, there's no set way to do this because I'm complimenting Carl Reiner for how he handled it. But there's also the opposite where, like, that's a very similar story to how Stallone sold Rocky, where he got told no 10 million times because he wanted to play Rocky. And then eventually he was able to. And now Stallone, obviously, has been a massive star for 50 years. So it does work out also. But the part that I'm focused on with Carl Reiner is he could have become a very bitter guy. Either A, he could have been miserable and said, no, I want to be the main character. This is my show. I wrote it and I want to be the star of it. Or he could have allowed Dick Van Dyke to star in it and become incredibly bitter. But neither of those things happened because Carl Reiner just had the right perspective. He had the perfect perspective to be the guy that he was. Sometimes on camera, sometimes behind the scenes. And eventually, they brought him on to be Alan Brady on the Dick Van Dyke Show. Mm-hmm. And for those of you that don't know, it's a show, like you just said, it's a show about the writer's room. And now that's a very common thing. Yeah, Larry David plays himself. You had Entourage, which is about the business of Hollywood. 30 Rock is like that. Larry Sanders Show. There's so many shows throughout the years that have been about the business. At that time, that was incredibly foreign to people. Mm-hmm. And Carl Reiner looked at it as like, hey, I'm just writing what I know, and I think that's what I would be best at. And so there's a lot that went into that we'll get into right now.
Yeah, there's Dick's job here.
Yeah, so there was, scrutiny over what profession the main character should be. And like I said, Reiners' perspective was, well, I want to write something that I know, so he should be a TV writer. And the network didn't understand that.
The idea of a writer being the star of a situation comedy was new and also fought against by the head of the network. He said when he saw the pilot, he said, very good, very good. He said, but wouldn't it be better if he did something that everybody could understand and identify with, like, for instance, an accountant or... I says, yeah, sure, we can make him an accountant, and then we'll talk numbers in the office. I said, don't you realize what we're doing? He's working. He's a working man and having all the problems of a working man. But when he's in the office, he's making jokes because that's what they do for a living. And we can do bad, good jokes. If it's a bad joke, we'll say, don't put it in. I was an accountant. It would have to be a funny accountant. And I said, there was only one. That was, at the time, it was Bob Newhart.
Yeah, and he's not Bob Newhart, goddammit. So, but that's such a great point where this is where, like, executives have slowed down comedy and television forever. Or I'm sure it's true of dramatic television and movies as well, where they don't understand the vision of the creative type that they are hiring to do this job. They're saying, hey, Carl Reiner, you're a really funny, interesting, innovative guy. We'd like you to write a TV show. And Carl Reiner says, well, this is the best way to do it. And they're like, nah, I think I know the best way to do it, actually, as a matter of fact, even though we just said that you're the creative one, And Carl Reiner says, well, A, he's looking at it from the perspective of there's so many more jokes we could tell and things like that. But it's also like he looked at it early on and opened the world up to a profession that people were interested in. Like, people didn't know how the TV business worked. And he said they found out through filming the Dick Van Dyke Show, he thought, oh, a lot of people are here to just see the show. Like, oh, we watch it on TV. Wouldn't we like to see it live? And what he realized is, oh, people are coming to see how a show works. Like, because of a show like that, people were interested in the behind the scenes stuff.
Right.
Like, how do they film it? How many takes do they use? All that stuff. And now executive, the same type of executive that was pushing back on Carl Reiner, will say to people, we'd really like something about Inside Hollywood instead of the accountant show you're pitching. Do you have anything like that? Because that's what they know now. They know that works. So it's a weird rigidness where they've never been able to, like, they know what works and they want that. They've never been able to open their mind up enough. I'm sure there are plenty of examples of people that do open their mind. Like HBO has obviously been very good at it through the years. But so many times you hear these guys, these legendary guys, have stories of people pushing back because executives just weren't willing to try something. And luckily, Carl Reiner was able to push enough that they did end up getting that on the air, where, you know, it's a 1950s version of Hollywood, so you weren't getting the real deal, but it was a step forward into getting something like the Larry Sanders Show, you know?
That's why you could see mattresses in the corner of every room in that show, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about that in a second, too, I think. There's a lot of, you know, Carl Reiner didn't win every battle, necessarily.
Next, Steve Martin.
Oh, well, let me, I didn't, I thought we were on Dick Van Dyke a little longer, but let me give one more detail, is that we talked about this a lot with Lucille Ball as well, where Carl Reiner did not win the battle of some of the censors. Like it was famously, that's an example of a married couple that slept in two separate beds, which I never understood. Like, I don't get who that was benefiting, because there wasn't a couple that was like, well, we sleep in separate beds, so that's what everyone should be doing. Like, all married couples slept in the same bed. Who are they fooling, I guess, is my question, with that version of censoring.
I mean, it's probably for what, like maybe 3%. I'm sure it happens.
My only thought is, like, people didn't want to have to explain it to their kids, but then it's like, well, what do they think when you guys are in the same bed, you know?
Maybe don't watch it while they're in the room.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't get it, but Carl Reiner explaining it was very interesting, because he talked about how, well, what we did is show their love through the writing. Like, you could tell this was a couple, based on how we wrote it, you could tell this was a couple that was intimate. We didn't have to overtly say it, but we wrote it in a way that you could tell this was a couple that loved each other, that was intimate, even though there are scenes where they get into two separate beds and turn the lights out for the night.
Right.
So let's hear a little bit about, so Steve Martin, like I mentioned, Mel Brooks, Dick Van Dyke, Sid Caesar, a lot of these guys he was tied to and had great relationships with, and Steve Martin is another one of those guys. So Steve Martin, who we also did an episode about, we really had no choice but to do a Carl Reiner episode, because we've done one about everyone else in his life.
Yeah, I know.
So Steve Martin has kind of graduated, I guess, from stand-up comedy into the movie business, and they wanted to do his first big feature film, and they were looking at bringing in a seasoned director.
Really, you're responsible for, I think, Steve Martin's film career, right? Because you directed him in his first, four movies?
I did. I'm not. Nobody's responsible for Steve Martin, the person, because he is the single most brilliantly funny writer I've ever read. And serious writer. He writes like a dream. There's another writer who writes pretty well. Barack Obama's autobiography is one of the best ever written. Born Standing Up, Steve Martin's biography, one of the best biographies ever written. Sad, funny, brilliant. He's written a book on art that is as brilliant as can be. He is an absolutely brilliant writer. But when he did the first movie, The Jerk, is that was it?
Yeah, the first one.
It was written by the other guys.
I like a guy, and granted, Carl Reiner's a little older when he's doing this interview, but I like a guy that's done so much in his life. He's like, was The Jerk? Was that what I did with Steve Martin? a legendary comedy.
Yeah, like
is that what it was called?
Yeah, and a lot of like the generations before us, like it's in all of their top 10s.
Yeah, for sure.
I came in, and he had never done anything but stand-up. So the first time he ever talked to other actors was in The Jerk. And I did help him a little with that. But mainly, he's one of these guys you place on the ground and just say, go, go. He's just absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, and so they did 4 movies together. The Jerk, probably the most notable, because like Craig said, that's probably Steve Martin's defining movie, I would think. Like, that's what people point to as not just his first movie, but it's like his best movie. And Steve Martin wrote it, obviously, so he gets a lot of credit there. But like, I think that's where that's how people remember the best version of Steve Martin would be his performance in The Jerk. And Carl Reiner was a guy that was brought in to direct him. And again, in the wrong hands, if you look at what Steve Martin was as a comedian, in the wrong hands, his movie career could have been a disaster.
Abysmal, yeah.
Because a lot of people didn't understand him at that time. Well, again, like Steve Martin's influenced a ton of people, so we've seen that kind of comedy a lot since him. But like he was a very new type of comedy in his stand-up career. So the wrong director, or even like we just talked about with Dick Van Dyke, if his movie gets kind of ripped apart by executive notes and all that stuff. Maybe we're not talking about Steve Martin, the legend. We're saying, remember the guy who did a couple comedy specials and then fizzled out at a shitty movie career? But like in the right hands, Steve Martin's able to flourish. And I think that's what Carl Reiner did, is when you have a talent like Steve Martin, you're able to kind of just let him go. So I think a guy like Carl Reiner, who's able to take a back seat in a situation like that, is absolutely pivotal to make Steve Martin into the film legend he became.
Yeah, and here we have Steve Martin and Carl talking about The Jerk a little more.
Okay, let's hear that.
I was called in because Steve had started doing this movie. I mean, he had written a movie, and it was called The Jerk, and it was rife to be a starring role for a starring. And
I'm going to correct you.
Yes.
Because it wasn't called The Jerk.
It was
called, at that time, what happened is I had this idea for a movie based on some material from my act, and I wrote it with, at different times, I can't remember the sequence, with Michael Elias and Carl Gottlieb.
Right.
And it was called Easy Money.
Oh, Easy Money, right.
When you came in, you liked the script, and you were kind of a directorial god then.
I still am.
Yeah, I know. Well, you had just done Oh God and had all these hits and everything. And also I had respected your entire career. And so we worked in the room over there and we were talking. I said, it needs a kind of title, and I think I just read Dostoevsky's The Idiot. I said, it needs a title like that, like The Jerk, or something like The Jerk.
Yes.
And then that's when it became The Jerk.
There's something to that too, where you don't have an appreciation for it because you don't even really notice it. But like a poorly titled movie could kind of derail it. You know what I mean? If people just think it sounds stupid,
right?
Not that the original title would have done that really, but that is the thing like people don't really think about.
Well, the something back then, especially being called The Jerk, is gonna get way more eyeballs being like, "What's that?"
Yeah, it's almost salacious. You're like,
right?
Ooh, that's naughty. But yeah, Steve Martin's so fucking funny, man. And it's like, as a kid, I didn't have an appreciation for Steve Martin really.
Neither.
Because I think the first thing I ever saw him in was Cheaper by the Dozen.
That was the first thing I saw him in as well.
I'm pretty sure, yeah. So like, I didn't have an appreciation for his brilliance, but then obviously like doing the episode about him reading his book or listening to his book, he's so brilliant. And Carl Reiner tells the story of the first clip we heard was Carl Reiner accepting the Mark Twain Prize, which is like, I guess, kind of like the Lifetime Achievement Award for comedy. It's become more or less. And Carl Reiner always tells the story. I couldn't find the video, unfortunately, but he tells the story of Steve Martin. He goes, all the people closest to me were there at this event, except Steve Martin. Steve Martin sent in a video, and he, gives this thing like, I appreciate everything you did for my career. I so wish I could be there to watch you accept the Mark Twain Prize. Unfortunately, and I mean, this is such a coincidence, and I hate it, but unfortunately, I had a dinner reservation next door, so I could not make it. And they zoom out, and you realize he is at the restaurant next door. So he just didn't go for this bit. He's so brilliantly funny, and yeah, it's good that he had a guy like Carl Reiner there to kind of nurture him into movies. And again, sometimes I'm guilty of overstating these things. Maybe Steve Martin just would have been, no matter who was directing him, he would have been successful. But I do think it is definitely a positive that he had a guy that was able to kind of let him be him and kind of take a back seat as a director.
And when you can say that stuff, because there's no question that the two of them together worked. The other one's definitely, there's variables. So
for sure, yeah.
The next we have him talking about reality and writing.
So I think this is actually I just had them out of the order I wanted them, I think, but this is the the clip I was looking for during the Dick Van Dyke thing, because I think it's so important. We talk about it a lot with Norman Lear, rest in peace. But this is the thing Norman Lear said a lot too, is writing that's based in reality is just naturally so much better. And because we're raised on TV now, you get a lot less of that. You get people emulating what they saw on TV growing up.
Right.
And that's what Carl Reiner is talking about here.
Yeah, because when it's based in reality, you can remember every fine detail and just add to every. I like it so much better.
Well, what happens is it breeds unoriginality. Because even me, like if I like as a guy who's not a writer, so maybe this is not true if you asked like Tina Fey or something, but as a guy who's not a writer, I would think of other television shows immediately.
Right.
You know what I mean? I'm sure that's kind of just a natural instinct is like, oh, I grew up watching Seinfeld. I want to write a show like Seinfeld. Whereas Carl Reiner didn't have that.
Right.
You know, he grew up, he was a sewing machine salesman when he was 16. And then he was in World War II. Like those are his memories as a kid. And then, like, you know, getting married and living a real life and coming up through old school Hollywood. These are the things he was writing about. And I think that's very important as he's talking about here.
In the shows that I consider good shows, there's usually one reality. There's somebody who thought of that show, and it's their show, the Gary Goldbergs and the Larry Davids, and the shows that work. And the Roseanne. It's Roseanne's reality. Somebody's reality. But... and nobody can know what your reality is. You have to. Frank Tarloff was the best, gave me the best line. I said, "It's got to be real." He's, "Who's real? You're real or my real?" It's my real. I don't know you're real. So you got to. So when writers come to write for a show, they have to put their reality, you know, in tow.
And I think that's. And Roseanne's actually a great example of that. Because she's writing about just like a white trash, like that. You wouldn't think that would be perfect for television, but then you realize it's Roseanne's experience. She grew up like that, so she's able to write about it, and it connects with people. You know, like that's why a lot of kids like me would watch Roseanne because it felt familiar. It felt kind of like their house or their friend's house or something. So I think that's definitely incredibly important. Not that you have to write about, like, you know, I don't think necessarily the Dick Van Dyke Show, if Carl Reiner is writing it, had to be about a writer's room, because that's all Carl Reiner knows necessarily. Right. I think it's more he has to insert some level of reality to it, meaning like that character has to relate to Carl Reiner. If you're trying to write, you know, like Archie Bunker is based on Norman Lear's father. If it was based on something Norman Lear had seen on television, it would just, there would be an element of phoniness to it. It wouldn't seem real. It would seem like you were copying something.
Yeah, and back then, like in music too, there was just so many less ideas already done.
Right.
You know, so because like I mean, there's only so many notes on a guitar or whatever, so you gotta be very original now, and especially nowadays, everything's getting remade, and every show is not an original idea, so it already starts, you know, under.
Well, that I mean, the hard thing too now is like you listen to a bunch of stand-ups on podcasts where they're talking about bits that they're doing, and then they'll get a comment. Like I remember this coming up recently with I guess David Spade put a special out where he was doing a bit similar to something Mark Normand had, and they were both released at the same time, and Norman was like, luckily I had the receipts where I could be like, well, here's when mine came out. Right. Because people are like looking to be like, oh, you stole this idea or that idea. But I think now we're just at a point that so many things have been done in some way, shape, or form. Not necessarily even everyone has seen them, but just enough ideas have been put out there that it's going to be similar to something else.
Right. Rob Schneider and Shane Gillis just had that too, because
boy, that's disappointing.
I know, but it was a kind of funny joke. But I think Rob Schneider's special came out on like Fox News or something.
It did, yes, it did. On Fox News On Demand or something like that.
And Shane was talking, and he filmed his special. It hadn't come out yet, and the joke was in there, and it was about if Joe Biden was a dog, you'd put it down. It was like that.
Okay. Yeah.
He's like, I saw the commercial for his special and I went, fuck.
Deuce Bigelow is doing my joke.
Right. But here we have him doing a dirty joke on Conan.
Okay, yeah, this is it functioned. The reason this is in here, it functioned both as a way to talk about his work with George Burns, who he directed in Oh God. But also, I just wanted to include this because I think it's a little longer, because once you get to the end, you realize some of the stuff about censorship back in the day, and for as much bitching as we might do, how far we've really come with television.
There's one story, I don't know if I can tell it, about George.
About George? Yeah, you can tell it here. I think so. Okay. Yeah.
There are no children in the audience.
No children in the audience,
Okay.
no. Well, there's Andy and I. We're there.
But he was a dear man. As a matter of fact, one little story about it, we changed the scene one day, and I said, George, we're going to do a different scene today, so you better memorize. He says, I memorized the whole script. He memorized the whole.
And he would have been in his late 80s or 90s then.
He was in his late 80 something.
Yeah, okay.
The last day of shooting, I went into his trailer to say goodbye to him, and I said, George, I'd like to ask you a question. I said, I would wonder what's in store for me sexually. I said, I always see you, you're 80 now, I was 60 at the time.
Right.
I said, I always see you with two girls on the arm going out to dinner. I said, what do I have to look forward sexually? And he said to me, Carl, you ever try to put an oyster in a slot machine? Is that going to, will this be on?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. I won't get arrested.
Okay. What a lovely anecdote.
You know, I'm thinking now, when I first was on television, the censors, when we did the show of shows, Sid Caesar and I were in a sketch where we're being bombed in the World War I. The Germans are dropping bombs on us, and Sid is yelling at the heavens. He says, damn you, damn you. And the censor says, you can't say damn.
Right.
We couldn't say damn. So, darn you.
Yeah.
As we had to say.
Yeah.
And here I said that here.
Yeah.
It's such a funny example to be like how far we've come when what you're talking about is shoving a limp 80-year-old dick into a pussy.
and you can't, in a war scene, say damn.
I like that because Carl Reiner's like, are we going to get arrested?
Yeah, I know.
It was kind of a moment where he's like, boy, what a pioneer I am. We've really come a long way.
But we have reached our favorite portion of the show.
Oh, wow. This flew by. So we're at him with Norm already, huh?
Yep.
He had a great appearance on Norm Macdonald Live and had a lot of fun with Adam Egget. And we get to hear a little bit about that here.
My first Twitter, I remember, was a good one. It was, sometimes I'm beginning to worry about my short-term memory loss. That was Sometimes I'm beginning to worry about my short-term memory loss. Sometimes I'm beginning to worry about my short-term memory loss. That was it.
Real Ed McMahon over here, huh? Stepped right in the middle of your thing.
Ed McBoy.
That's your nickname from now on, fella. Ed McBoy.
You can tell Norm always loved having those old guys on too.
I know.
But and you know, guys, let me know if there's stuff that I brushed over with Carl Reiner. I feel like we hit the big stuff because in his latter years, he kind of just did whatever he wanted. He would make appearances like that, like you saw him with Conan and Norm and all of this. He would pop up he would do a lot of voiceover work or, you know, one-offs in episodes of sitcoms and stuff like that. He kind of just did whatever he wanted in his later years. He was relaxed, which is nice to see. And he passed away at 98 years old in 2020. The last thing he did was something they were doing during COVID, where they were basically doing, like, you know how a lot of people did like those table reads and stuff like that during COVID? Yeah. They were trying to do something like that. They called it like Home Videos, The Princess Bride. Mm-hmm. And the last scene is Carl Reiner and Rob Reiner reenacting a scene where, I don't know The Princess Bride well enough, but Carl Reiner's line is something to the effect of like, all is well or something like that. Andy Mayo will know better than me what it is. But in the translation of the movie, it basically means "I love you." And so, like, the last thing, and this is days before he passed away. So the last thing he ever did on camera was basically telling his son he loved him, which was kind of a nice moment. And even like, we mentioned Norman Lear at the beginning, who also is unfortunately no longer with us. And they said that like Norman Lear was just hanging out with Carl Reiner back in the day and saw Rob Reiner as a young kid. And Rob Reiner would just like do stuff around them. And Norman was like, this kid's funny. And then eventually he had a show called All in the Family where he was like, I think Rob Reiner should play Meathead. Like that's what those bonds created. And, now like we look at it as nepotism and stuff like that. But these guys were so close that they just had that sort of relationship where they kind of wanted to help each other out and they liked each other's families and hung out and all that stuff. So like Carl Reiner, really an admirable career. Like I didn't know a ton about him necessarily, but I enjoyed learning more about it. Oh, he also I forgot to mention this. He wrote 12 books. He's also an accomplished author. So the guy did a lot throughout his career. So look more into Carl Reiner. That's the purpose of these episodes, folks, is either walking down memory lane with you or introducing people to you that you're not quite as familiar with. So if you don't know a ton about Carl Reiner, look into him because he's an interesting guy who definitely did a ton for television and comedy in general. So rest in peace, Carl Reiner. Rest in peace, Norman Lear. You're next, Mel Brooks. We're coming for you. Like I said, let me know about Ralph as well from the Howard Stern Show, and maybe we will do a bonus episode on him as well. Hope you guys enjoy. We have a couple episodes coming up at the end of the year, kind of like year in the review type stuff. We got the best specials of 2023 coming up, and I was thinking of possibly also doing the comics to watch in 2024. If you guys would be interested in that, let me know, and I'll put a list together, and we'll do episodes about that for the end of the year. And best place to reach me is blindmike.net. That's where all our links are, for goodness sake. Whether you want to support the show for free or become a member on Patreon or YouTube, you get bonus content if you are a member. So consider that. Go to blindmike.net. We have merch up there as well. So all those links are there at blindmike.net. And you can find Craig's stuff at verygoodshow.org, right?
Yep. New episode of Rubbed Out. If you're listening on Patreon, came out yesterday. If you're listening for free, came out last week. So check that out.
It's Craig's true crime podcast where he's ripped off this format and talking about crime. So if you like this type of format, I guess check that out as well. Verygoodshow.org. And follow our boy Hackride too. Hackride on YouTube. And I think he has a website. I don't know what it is. Does he have a website?
I don't know, but I think his Twitter handle is @Hackride. So I'm sure.
So follow him on YouTube and Twitter, and if you follow me, it's easy enough to find him. So
yes.
Go find Hackride.
Just look at the comments for the guy just typing in all caps and yelling.
Yeah. All right, guys. Thank you. We appreciate it, and rest in peace, Carl Reiner. And we'll talk to you guys next time. Until then, what do I say at the end of this? We'll talk to you next time on Why You Laughing. Goodbye.
Zip it up and zip it out.